The words flew from his mouth like venom, each Mandarin syllable designed to wound what he assumed was her ignorance, until she looked up from her mop and answered him in perfect Beijing dialect. Welcome back, beautiful souls. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because tomorrow's story will blow your mind and you won't want to miss it. Tonight, a billionaire's cruel words in Mandarin, a cleaning lady's shocking response, and a lockdown that changes two hearts forever. Let's begin. The 42nd floor of the Chen Tower never slept, but tonight it felt more like a mausoleum than the beating heart of a billion-dollar empire. Chen Wei stood behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city spread below him like a circuit board. Each light representing lives he'd never touch, dreams he'd never understand. His reflection stared back sharp cheekbones, expensive suit hanging perfectly on his lean frame, dark eyes that had learned too early to trust nothing and no one. The Patek Philippe on his wrist read 11:47 p.m. Another 18-hour day bleeding into the next. He'd dismissed his assistant 3 hours ago, sent the last of his executives home to their families, their warm beds, their simple problems. Chen preferred the silence. Silence didn't disappoint. It didn't whisper behind his back about the poor boy from Guangzhou who'd clawed his way to American shores with nothing but stubborn pride and an appetite for revenge against a world that had once kicked him when he was down. His fingers drummed against the mahogany desk. Italian leather, hand-carved, worth more than most people made in a year. Everything in this office screamed success, from the original Monet on the wall to the vintage scotch that remained untouched in its crystal decanter. Yet tonight, like so many others, the luxury felt hollow. Victory was supposed to taste sweeter than this. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Chen." His night security manager's voice crackled through. "The cleaning crew is here for the executive floor. Should I send them up?" Chen didn't look away from the window. The cleaning people were invisible to him, had been for years. They moved through his world like ghosts, erasing the evidence of his days while he pretended they didn't exist. It was easier that way. Cleaner. What do you think drives successful people to work such long, lonely hours? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your perspective on the cost of ambition. 3 floors below, in the building's basement break room, Jade Thompson sat on a plastic chair that had seen better decades, lacing up her worn sneakers with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to make things last. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional beige that made beautiful people look tired and tired people look invisible. She was both. At 34, Jade carried herself with the kind of quiet grace that came from being looked through rather than at. Her dark skin held the subtle glow of someone who took care of herself despite circumstances that would have broken others, and her natural hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that emphasized the elegant line of her neck. But it was her eyes that told the real story, intelligent, watchful, holding depths that her current uniform could never contain. The blue cleaning smock hung loose on her frame, the name tag reading J. Thompson in block letters that reduced her to a function rather than a person. She'd worn variations of this uniform for 3 years now, ever since her world had collapsed and rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable. The work was honest, if not easy. It kept a roof over her head and food in her stomach, and in the small apartment she shared with her teenage nephew that counted as victory. "You taking the executive floors tonight, Jade?" Rosa, her supervisor, poked her head into the break room. Rosa was good people, a grandmother from El Salvador who understood that everyone had a story, and some stories were better left unasked. "Yes, ma'am." Jade stood, smoothing the smock. Building's mostly empty by now, except for that Chen fellow. Man works like he's running from something. Rosa shook her head. "You be careful up there. Rich men like that, they don't see us as people. We're just part of the furniture to them." Jade nodded, but something in her expression suggested she'd learned that lesson long before she'd ever set foot in this building. She'd been furniture before, expensive, well-maintained, admired from a distance. She knew the difference between being seen and being noticed, and she'd made peace with invisibility. It was safer here in the shadows. The service elevator carried her up through the building's layers, the lower floors where middle management fought their small battles, the mid-levels where vice presidents made decisions that would affect lives they'd never meet, and finally to the executive floor where the real power lived. The doors opened with a soft chime, releasing her into a world of marble and mahogany, of art that cost more than most people's houses and silence thick enough to drown in. Her cart rolled quietly across the polished floor, wheels whispered on stone that had been quarried in Italy and laid by craftsmen who spoke in reverent tones about veining and grain. Jade began her routine, emptying wastebaskets that contained the discarded dreams of a dozen meetings, wiping down conference tables where fortunes were made and lost over handshakes and hushed conversations. She worked methodically, efficiently, her movements economical, and sure, this was meditation for her, the rhythm of honest labor that asked nothing more than presence and care. In the quiet hours after midnight, she could almost pretend she was alone in a museum, tending to treasures that belonged to everyone and no one. Through the glass walls of the corner office, she could see him, Chen Wei, the man whose name adorned the building, whose reputation reached into corners of the business world she'd once inhabited from a very different angle. He stood motionless at his window like a statue carved from ambition and isolation, and for a moment Jade felt something unexpected, recognition. She knew that posture, the way someone stands when they're successful by every measure that matters to the world, yet still waiting for the satisfaction that was supposed to come with winning. She'd seen it in mirrors back when her reflection had been framed by different walls, when her uniform had been academic robes, and her battles had been fought with words instead of silence. The cart's wheel caught on something, a slight imperfection in the marble, and Jade paused to free it, her attention focused on the task rather than the man who had turned from his window to watch her work. Neither of them knew that in less than an hour, a moment of careless cruelty would crack open both their carefully constructed worlds, revealing truths that would change everything they thought they knew about power, pride, and the courage it takes to be seen. The building held its breath around them, waiting. The mistake was small, a coffee ring on the mahogany conference table that had somehow survived the afternoon cleaning. Chen Wei noticed it the moment he stepped out of his office to retrieve a file from the cabinet, the white circle standing out against the dark wood like an accusation. It shouldn't have mattered. In the grand scheme of his empire, one water stain was nothing. But tonight, exhausted and raw from a day of battles fought on multiple fronts, it felt like the final insult in a long series of small failures. The missed call from his mother in Shanghai that he'd ignored for the third day running. The merger that had fallen through because of someone else's carelessness. The empty penthouse apartment waiting for him at the end of another hollow victory. Chen's jaw tightened as he watched Jade work methodically around the room, her movements careful and quiet. She hadn't seen the stain yet, was focused on organizing the scattered papers from the day's final meeting. The sight of her calm efficiency when his own world felt like it was spinning just slightly off its axis, ignited something dark in his chest. "Excuse me." His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Jade looked up from the papers she was straightening, her expression politely attentive. "Yes, sir." Chen pointed at the coffee ring with one perfectly manicured finger. "Did you miss this, or did you simply not care?" The words came out harsher than he'd intended, but he didn't soften them. He was Chen Wei. He didn't apologize to the help. Jade's eyes followed his gesture to the stain, and he saw something flicker across her face, not guilt or fear, but something closer to disappointment. "I'm sorry, sir. I'll take care of it right away." She moved toward her cart to retrieve the wood cleaner. But Chen wasn't finished. The day's frustrations had found their target, and 3 years of built-up irritation at small imperfections, at things not being exactly as he demanded them, came pouring out in a torrent of Mandarin that he assumed would wash over her like meaningless noise. "这就是我雇佣你们这些人时得到的吗?" He spat, his voice rising with each syllable. 无知的，懒惰的，不注意细节。你认为因为你在深夜工作，没有人会注意到你的马虎吗？ Is this what I get when I hire people like you? Ignorant, lazy, not paying attention to details. Do you think because you work late at night, no one will notice your carelessness? The words hung in the air like smoke, designed to wound and diminish. Chen had learned long ago that people feared what they couldn't understand, and he'd used that knowledge as a weapon more times than he cared to count. The cleaning woman would hear only anger in a foreign tongue, would know she was being berated without understanding the specific cruelties he was inflicting. But Jade had gone very still. She straightened slowly, the wood cleaner forgotten in her hand, and when she turned to face him, something in her posture had shifted. The careful invisibility she'd worn like armor was falling away, replaced by something Chen hadn't expected to see in this sterile corporate tomb: dignity. "Chen Sansheng," she began, her voice low and clear, each word precisely enunciated in flawless Beijing dialect. 我理解您今天过得很艰难，但这并不给您权利假设我的智力或我的价值观。Mr. Chen, I understand you've had a difficult day, but that doesn't give you the right to make assumptions about my intelligence or my character. Time stopped. Chen felt the blood drain from his face as the impossible words registered in his mind. Not just Mandarin, educated Mandarin, spoken with the refined accent of someone who had learned it not in weekend classes or phrasebooks, but in lecture halls and scholarly discussions. The grammar was perfect, the tone respectful but firm, and underneath it all was something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't immediately name: shame. 这个屋子是在我开始清洁之前就已经在那里了，但我会很乐意清理它。This stain was here before I began cleaning, but I'll be happy to remove it. Jade continued, her eyes meeting his directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. 我也理解您可能认为像秀这样的人不值得您的尊重，但我希望您知道，我们都在尽自己最大的努力生存和保持尊严。I also understand that you might think someone like me doesn't deserve your respect, but I hope you know that we're all doing our best to survive and maintain our dignity. The silence that followed was deafening. Chen stood frozen, his mind reeling as everything he thought he knew about this woman, this person he had dismissed as furniture, as background noise in his important life, crumbled around him. She wasn't just speaking Mandarin, she was speaking it better than some of his business associates, with a sophistication that suggested not just language study but cultural immersion. And the way she'd addressed him with respect. Yes, but also with the kind of measured dignity that suggested she knew exactly who she was speaking to and had chosen her words with the precision of someone accustomed to being heard. "What?" Chen started, then stopped. For the first time in longer than he could remember, words failed him entirely. Jade watched him struggle, and something in her expression softened just slightly. Not pity. Chen would have recognized pity and hated her for it. This was something more complex, more generous, understanding perhaps. Recognition. "Would you like me to clean that now, Mr. Chen?" she asked, switching back to English with the same fluid grace she'd shown in Mandarin. "Or would you prefer I come back later?" The normalcy of the question, the professional courtesy in her tone, somehow made the moment even more surreal. Here was a woman who had just revealed herself to be far more than she appeared, who had responded to his cruel assumptions with grace, instead of anger, and she was asking if he wanted her to clean his conference table. Chen looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since she'd entered his world 3 years ago. The intelligence in her dark eyes that he'd never bothered to notice, the way she held herself with quiet strength, despite circumstances that should have broken her, the careful way she'd chosen to reveal herself, not in anger or defiance, but in dignity. "How long?" The question came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sir, how long have you—" He gestured helplessly, his usual command of language in any language deserting him. "How long have you understood?" A small, sad smile touched the corners of Jade's mouth. "Every word, Mr. Chen. Every single word." The weight of that simple statement hit him like a physical blow. 3 years of dismissive comments, of conversations conducted over her head, as if she weren't there, of casual cruelties delivered in the language of his childhood because he'd assumed she was deaf to their meaning. She had heard it all. And she had said nothing, had continued to clean his office, and straighten his papers and empty his waste paper basket with the same quiet efficiency, carrying the burden of his unconscious prejudices with a grace he was beginning to realize he didn't deserve. Chen Wei, who had built an empire on the foundation of never showing weakness, felt something crack open in his chest. For the first time in decades, he had no idea what to say. Jade moved to her cart and retrieved a different cleaner, one specifically designed for wood. She approached the conference table with the same careful movements she'd used before, but now Chen saw them differently, not the mechanical motions of hired help, but the deliberate care of someone who took pride in her work regardless of how others saw it. She worked on the stain in silence, her movements efficient and sure. Chen watched, transfixed, as the white ring disappeared under her careful attention, leaving the mahogany flawless once again. When she was finished, she stepped back and looked at him with those intelligent eyes that had seen through him from the beginning. "Is there anything else you need tonight, Mr. Chen?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to address. Chen felt the familiar urge to retreat to his office, to pretend this moment had never happened, to restore the comfortable distance that had existed between them for 3 years. But something in her gaze held him there, in the space between who he had been and who he might become if he was brave enough to cross it. He began, then stopped, the apology caught somewhere between his pride and his conscience. Jade waited, patient and still, and for the first time since he'd built his tower of success, Chen Wei felt small. Chen Wei retreated to his office like a wounded animal seeking shelter. His hands shook as he closed the door behind him, the soft click of the latch echoing in the silence that had suddenly become unbearable. Through the glass walls, he could see Jade continuing her work, moving with the same methodical precision she'd shown for 3 years, as if the world hadn't just tilted on its axis. But everything had changed. He slumped into his leather chair, the expensive Italian leather that usually reminded him of his success, now feeling cold against his back. His reflection in the dark window showed a man he barely recognized, face pale, eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to panic. Chen Wei didn't panic, he conquered, he commanded, he controlled. He did not get schooled in basic human decency by the cleaning staff. Think. He commanded himself, fingers drumming against the desk in sharp, staccato beats. There has to be an explanation. Maybe she'd taken classes, night school perhaps, or one of those language apps. Yes, that made sense. Someone ambitious, trying to better themselves, learning enough Mandarin to impress. Except her accent had been perfect. Not just fluent, educated. The kind of pronunciation that came from years of immersion, from speaking with native speakers in academic or professional settings. His computer screen glowed to life at the touch of his fingers. Chen stared at the search bar, cursor blinking expectantly. He'd never looked up an employee before, that was HR's job, but tonight felt like a night for breaking his own rules. J. Thompson, he typed, then deleted it. Too generic. Jade Thompson cleaning, then deleted that too. His usual confidence in extracting information had abandoned him, leaving him feeling exposed and foolish. What was he doing? Investigating the help like some paranoid corporate overlord. The thought made him uncomfortable in ways he wasn't ready to examine. But the questions wouldn't stop coming. Where had she learned to speak like that? Why was she working night shifts cleaning offices if she was clearly educated enough for what? He realized with another uncomfortable jolt that he had no idea what she was qualified to do, had never bothered to consider that she might be qualified for anything other than the job she was doing. The assumption sat in his stomach like a stone. Through the glass, he watched her work. Now that he was really looking, finally looking, he noticed things that should have been obvious years ago. The way she handled documents with careful respect, not just shuffling them but actually organizing them in a way that made sense. The books that occasionally fell from her cart, always in different languages, always thick, substantial texts that weren't exactly light reading, the way she moved through spaces with an awareness that suggested she understood the importance of what surrounded her. How had he missed it all? Pride, whispered a voice in his head that sounded uncomfortably like his mother. Pride and assumptions, Wei. They make you blind to everything that doesn't fit your story. Chen shook his head, trying to dislodge the uncomfortable truth. His mother had been calling him Wei since childhood, back when they'd shared a one-room apartment in Guangzhou, and she'd worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, back when he'd been nobody, nothing, just another poor kid with big dreams and bigger pride. He'd spent 20 years running from that boy, building walls of success and superiority so high that no one could see over them to the frightened child inside, and tonight, a woman with a mop and a perfect Beijing accent had scaled those walls like they were made of paper. 3 floors below, Jade Thompson stood in the supply closet, pressing her back against the cold metal shelving and trying to remember how to breathe normally. Her hands were trembling, not with fear but with the aftershock of being seen. For 3 years, she'd perfected the art of invisibility. Head down, voice quiet, movements efficient, but unremarkable. It was safer that way. Safer to be overlooked, to slip through the world without drawing attention, without having to explain how Dr. Jade Thompson, former professor of international relations at Columbia University, had ended up pushing a cleaning cart through the corridors of corporate power. But tonight, faced with his casual cruelty, delivered in the language she'd spent 15 years mastering, something inside her had snapped. Stupid, she thought, rubbing her temples where a headache was beginning to build. Stupid. She could have just endured it, like she had all the other times. Let his words wash over her, let him think what he wanted to think, kept her head down and her secrets safe. That's what survival looked like, not fighting every battle, especially not the ones you couldn't win. But the look on his face when the words had tumbled out of her mouth, she'd seen shock. Yes, but also something else. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he'd seen himself reflected in her careful dignity. And that terrified her more than his anger ever could. Her phone buzzed with a text from her nephew Marcus. Working late again? Don't forget you have real life too, Aunt Jay, and she felt the familiar pang of guilt that came with living in half-truths. Marcus knew she cleaned offices, but he didn't know about the stack of rejection letters hidden in her dresser drawer, the academic positions she'd applied for and been turned down from, the slow erosion of hope that had led her here. How do you explain that your degree doesn't matter when your past follows you like a shadow? She thought. How do you tell a 17-year-old who believes in justice that sometimes the system breaks good people and leaves them to pick up the pieces however they can? She'd tried to go back to academia after the scandal, if you could call it that. Really, it had been nothing more than being in the wrong place at the wrong time, her research grant linked to funding that had turned out to be contaminated by political corruption she'd known nothing about. But in academic circles, perception was everything, and the perception had been that Dr. Jade Thompson's judgment was questionable at best. The job offers had dried up, the interview callbacks had stopped coming, and slowly, gradually, she'd found herself sliding down the economic ladder until night shift cleaning work was what kept the lights on and food on the table. But she'd kept studying, kept reading, kept the sharp edges of her mind honed even as the rest of her life dulled into routine. The Mandarin had been part of her research, back when she'd been investigating trade relationships between China and emerging African economies. She'd become fluent because the work demanded it, because she'd believed that understanding was the key to building bridges between cultures. Now that fluency felt like a loaded weapon she'd accidentally discharged. Her cart waited outside the supply closet, loaded with the tools of honest labor that had become her world. In a few minutes, she'd have to go back upstairs, finish her work, face whatever came next. Chen Wei would either pretend the moment had never happened, the most likely scenario, or he'd, what? Fire her? Demand an explanation? Report her to supervisors who would want to know why she hadn't mentioned her background when she was hired. The truth was complicated, and complicated truths rarely fit on employment applications or in the 5-minute conversations that determined whether someone deserved a chance to start over. Jade straightened her shoulders and reached for her cart. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same dignity she'd tried to maintain for the past 3 years. She'd made her choice the moment she'd opened her mouth, and now she would live with the consequences. But as she rolled the cart toward the service elevator, heading back to the 42nd floor where Chen Wei waited behind his glass walls, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd crossed a line she could never uncross. Some revelations, once spoken, changed everything. And somewhere in the fear and regret, buried so deep she barely acknowledged it, was a tiny flame of something that felt dangerously like hope. What do you think happens when we're forced to confront the assumptions we make about others? Have you ever discovered someone was completely different than you first thought? Share your story below. Sometimes the most profound connections come from the most unexpected places. The elevator doors closed with a soft whisper, carrying her back toward whatever came next. The emergency alarm's shrill cry cut through the building's silence at 1:23 a.m., followed immediately by the automated voice that every corporate drone knew but hoped never to hear. Attention! This building is now under security lockdown. All occupants must remain in place until further notice. This is not a drill. Chen's head snapped up from the employee records he'd been pretending to review for the past hour. Through his office windows, he could see the red emergency lights beginning their slow, hypnotic pulse, painting everything in an ominous crimson glow. His phone buzzed immediately, his head of security voice tight with controlled urgency. "Mr. Chen, we've got a situation. Armed robbery attempt at the jewelry store on the ground floor. SWAT's got the building surrounded, but they can't clear us until they're sure the suspects didn't make it into the main structure. Could be anywhere from 2 to 6 hours. Chen closed his eyes, feeling the universe's sense of irony settle around him like a weight. Of all the nights for his building to become the center of a crime scene, it had to be tonight. When he was already emotionally raw, when the woman whose life he'd just turned upside down was somewhere in this building, and when retreat was no longer an option. "Understood," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "What do I need to know?" "Stay where you are, sir. Don't use the elevators, they've been shut down remotely. Emergency lighting only. We've got 2 patrol officers in the building doing a sweep, but they're starting from the bottom and working up. You're probably looking at a long night." The line went dead, leaving Chen alone with the pulsing red lights and the growing realization that somewhere in this locked tower, Jade Thompson was facing the same situation. Only she didn't have the luxury of a private office, a personal phone line, or the knowledge that this was her building and she was safe. She was trapped with a man who had just seen her drop her carefully constructed mask in a building under siege, with nowhere to run. The elevator had died between the 20th and 21st floors, jerking to a halt so suddenly that Jade had to grip the handrail to keep from falling. The emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing the small space in that familiar hellish red glow, and then came the announcement that turned her blood to ice. Security lockdown. She'd heard those words before, in a different building during a different crisis that had ended with her world in flames. The memory hit her like a physical blow. University security, police cars, reporters with cameras, and questions she couldn't answer. Her career disappearing in a storm of innuendo and guilt by association. But that was years ago, and this was now, and panicking wouldn't change anything. Jade pressed the emergency call button, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. The voice that answered was professional but strained. "Ma'am, we're aware of your situation. We're working to get the elevators back online, but it's going to take some time. Can you access the emergency panel and engage the manual release?" Her fingers found the panel following the security officer's careful instructions. The doors opened with a reluctant groan, revealing the 21st floor, a maze of darkened cubicles and conference rooms that looked like a graveyard in the red emergency lighting. "I'm out," she reported. "Good. Now listen carefully. Do not attempt to use the stairwells. We need them clear for emergency personnel. Find a secure interior room and wait. This could take several hours. Several hours. In a building with a man who now knew she'd been lying by omission for 3 years, who'd seen her drop her mask in a moment of justified anger, and who had the power to end what little stability she'd managed to build. The irony wasn't lost on her. After years of successfully avoiding Chen Wei beyond their brief, professional interactions, the universe had locked them in the same building with nowhere to hide. Chen found her in conference room C, sitting at the long mahogany table with her cleaning supplies arranged in neat rows beside her like some sort of ritualistic offering to the gods of awkward timing. She'd removed her cleaning smock, revealing a simple black sweater that somehow made her look more like the professor she'd apparently once been and less like the invisible woman she'd trained herself to become. "I heard about the elevator," he said from the doorway, his voice carefully neutral. "Are you hurt?" Jade looked up, and in the red emergency lighting, her dark eyes seemed to hold depths he was only beginning to comprehend. "I'm fine, thank you, just waiting it out like everyone else." There was a beat of silence, heavy with everything they hadn't said and weren't sure how to say. Chen stepped into the room, leaving the door open, a gesture that somehow felt important, as if closed doors between them right now would be unbearable for both of them. "Security says it could be several hours," he offered, taking a seat 2 chairs down from her. Close enough to talk without shouting over the hum of emergency systems, far enough to maintain some semblance of the professional distance they'd maintained for 3 years. "I figured." Jade's hands were folded in her lap, her posture straight but not rigid. "I'm sorry about earlier, Mr. Chen. That was unprofessional." "Was it?" The question came out before he could stop it, and he found himself genuinely curious about her answer. She tilted her head slightly, studying him in the strange light. "You think standing up for myself was professional?" "I think," Chen paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think responding to disrespect with dignity is the most professional thing anyone can do. I'm the one who should be apologizing." The admission hung between them like a bridge, neither of them was quite ready to cross. Jade's expression softened just slightly, but she didn't rush to fill the silence with easy forgiveness. "You want to know how," she said finally. "It wasn't a question. If you're willing to tell me." Another pause, longer this time. Through the conference room's windows, they could see the city lights twinkling beyond the emergency chaos, normal people living normal lives while they sat in their red-lit limbo, finally forced to see each other clearly. "I used to teach," Jade said, her voice low but clear. "International relations at Columbia. My specialty was economic development in emerging markets, with a focus on Sino-African trade relationships. The Mandarin was necessary for the research." Chen felt something shift in his chest, a realignment of assumptions that was both painful and necessary. Used to. She met his eyes directly. "Things happened. My funding got tied up in a corruption investigation. Nothing I knew about, nothing I was involved in, but in academic circles, perception is everything. When the smoke cleared, I was radioactive. No university would touch me. So, you came here." "So I came here. It's honest work, Mr. Chen. It pays the bills and keeps my nephew in school." There was no self-pity in her voice, just the flat recital of facts that had reshaped her life. "I didn't mention my background when I applied, because experience has taught me that sometimes people prefer their assumptions to the truth." The words hit him like a physical blow, accurate and devastating. He had preferred his assumptions. They'd made his world simpler, cleaner, easier to navigate. Jade Thompson, the cleaning lady, was a function, a service provider, a problem to be solved when conference tables weren't spotless. Jade Thompson, former professor, expert in international economics, woman who spoke Mandarin with the fluency of someone who'd spent years building bridges between cultures, she was a person, complex and accomplished and deserving of respect he'd never bothered to offer. "I've been an ass," he said quietly. A small smile touched the corner of Jade's mouth. "You've been a busy man who didn't look past what he expected to see. There's a difference, is there?" I hope so, otherwise we're all doomed to stay exactly as we are forever. The emergency lighting pulsed around them, marking time in a space that felt suspended between who they'd been and who they might become. Outside, sirens wailed and police radios crackled, but inside conference room C, two people who had been strangers for 3 years were finally beginning to see each other. Chen looked at this woman, really looked at her, and felt something he hadn't experienced in longer than he could remember: curiosity about another human being. Not their usefulness to him, not their position in his hierarchy of importance, but who they actually were beneath the surface. "Tell me about your research," he said, and was surprised to find that he genuinely wanted to know. Jade's eyebrows rose slightly. "Really? Really? We've got time, and He paused, searching for words that would be honest without being pathetic. "I'd like to know who you actually are. If you're willing to share." For a moment, Jade just looked at him, as if weighing whether this moment of curiosity was genuine or just another form of condescension. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she leaned back in her chair and began to speak. "The thing people don't understand about economic development," she said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who had once commanded lecture halls, "is that it's never just about money. It's about relationships. Cultural understanding, trust built over generations and sometimes destroyed in moments." As she spoke, Chen found himself drawn into her words, not just by the intelligence behind them, but by the passion that lit her voice when she talked about work that had once meant everything to her. This was who she'd been before circumstances had stripped away everything but her resilience. This was who she still was, underneath the uniform and the careful invisibility. And for the first time in years, Chen Wei found himself listening not to gain advantage or gather information, but simply because another human being was sharing something precious with him. The red lights continued their hypnotic pulse, marking time in a space where two people were finally learning to see each other clearly. The emergency lighting had been pulsing for over an hour when Chen found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, talking about his mother. "She cleaned offices too," he said, the words emerging from some deep place he'd thought he'd sealed off long ago. "In Guangzhou, when I was young, 3 different buildings, 7 days a week. I used to wait for her in the lobby of the Tianhe Business Center, doing homework on my lap while she worked upstairs." Jade had been telling him about her research methodology, her voice animated as she described the months she'd spent in Shanghai interviewing trade officials and small business owners. But something in Chen's tone made her pause, her academic enthusiasm giving way to a different kind of attention. "You watched her work," she said softly. "It wasn't a question. Every night. Sometimes the security guards would let me go up with her, if the floors were empty." Chen's fingers traced patterns on the mahogany table, his eyes focused on something beyond the emergency-lit conference room. "I watched her clean the offices of men who made more in a day than she made in a year. Watched her empty their trash, wipe down their desks, make their spaces perfect for the next day's success." The memory was sharp and bitter, crystallized by decades of buried shame. "I swore I'd never be like them." The executives who walked past her like she was furniture, who complained about her work in voices loud enough for her to hear, who never learned her name even though she'd been cleaning their offices for 3 years. Jade was very still, recognizing the weight of what he was sharing. In the red-tinted darkness, she could see the boy he'd been proud, angry, watching his mother's dignity get chipped away night after night by casual indifference. "What happened to her?" Jade asked. Chen's jaw tightened. "She got sick. Lung problems from years of cleaning chemicals and dust. Couldn't work anymore, couldn't afford treatment. I was 17, already accepted to university on scholarship, but..." He stopped, the old pain still sharp after all these years. "You stayed." "I stayed. Worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat. Delayed university for 2 years. By the time she was stable enough for me to leave, I was so angry at the world that I think I forgot how to be anything else." He looked up at Jade, his eyes haunted. I came to America to become successful enough that no one could ever dismiss me the way they dismissed her, and somewhere along the way, I became one of them, the men who walked past her like she didn't exist. The admission hung between them, raw and honest in a way that made Jade's chest tighten with recognition. She understood now why her fluent Mandarin had hit him so hard, not just because it challenged his assumptions, but because it forced him to see his own transformation into everything he'd once hated. "Your mother," Jade said carefully, "what would she think of the man you've become?" Chen laughed, but there was no humor in it. "She'd be proud of my success and heartbroken by my coldness. She always said that money changes people, but love is what keeps them human." I think I forgot the second part somewhere along the way. The vulnerability in his voice was so unexpected, so complete, that Jade felt her own carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. For 3 years, she'd seen Chen Wei as a symbol of everything that was wrong with systems that valued wealth over humanity. But the man sitting across from her now wasn't a symbol, he was a person carrying his own wounds, his own complicated relationship with success and shame. "I had a daughter," she said suddenly, the words escaping before she could stop them. Chen's attention sharpened, but he didn't speak, sensing that she needed space to find her way to whatever truth she was about to share. Not biologically, but emotionally. In every way that mattered. Jade's hands had found each other in her lap, fingers interlaced like she was holding herself together. "Amira. She was one of my graduate students at Columbia, brilliant, passionate. From Somalia originally but raised in refugee camps before her family made it to the States." The memory brought both warmth and pain to Jade's voice. She was writing her thesis on microfinance in post-conflict economies, revolutionary stuff, the kind of work that could have changed how we think about rebuilding broken countries. But she was also struggling, financially, emotionally, the weight of being the first in her family to attend university, the pressure to succeed not just for herself, but for everyone who'd sacrificed to get her there. Chen found himself leaning forward, drawn into the story by something in Jade's tone that spoke to old wounds he recognized. "I mentored her, but it became more than that. She didn't have family in New York, and I'd never had children of my own, never found the right person or the right time. But Amira filled something in me I didn't even know was empty. We'd have dinner every Sunday, talk about her research, her dreams, her fears. She called me Mama Jade." The tears came without warning, 3 years of buried grief finally finding their way to the surface. Chen instinctively reached across the table, covering her clasped hands with his own, the first time they'd touched, the gesture so natural it surprised them both. "What happened?" he asked gently. "The corruption investigation I mentioned. It wasn't random. Someone was using my research grant to funnel money to political figures, using legitimate academic work as cover for their schemes. When the FBI started digging, they found Amira's name in the files, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because her thesis advisor me was connected to the funding." Jade's voice broke slightly, but she continued. "They threatened to revoke her visa, said her student status was compromised because of the investigation. She was terrified, convinced she'd brought shame on everyone who'd helped her get to America. I tried to fight it, hired lawyers, called in every favor I had, but the system had already decided who was expendable." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's emergency lighting. "She was deported? She took her own life." The words came out flat, matter-of-fact, as if emotion had been wrung out of them through years of repetition. 3 days before her thesis defense, left a note saying she couldn't bear to be the reason her family lost their chance at a better life. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the kind of grief that reshapes everything it touches. Chen's hand tightened over Jade's, offering what comfort he could to pain that felt infinite. "I blamed myself," Jade continued. "If I'd been more careful about the funding sources, if I'd protected her better, if I'd seen how much she was struggling, The university settled quietly, the investigation faded away, and I was left with a daughter-sized hole in my life, and a career that felt meaningless without her to share it with. That's why you stopped teaching. That's why I stopped living for a while. The cleaning job was supposed to be temporary, just something to pay bills while I figured out how to start over. But starting over means facing the possibility of caring about people again, of letting them matter enough to hurt you. It was easier to stay invisible, to keep moving without getting attached. Chen understood perhaps better than anyone could, the way survival sometimes meant cutting yourself off from everything that made life worth living. And your nephew, Marcus? A small smile touched Jade's lips. Amira's younger brother. Her family, they couldn't stay in Somalia. After she died, the grief was too heavy. They came here 2 years ago, and Marcus ended up in my care. He's brilliant, just like his sister, but he doesn't know the whole story. Doesn't know how she died, or why. He thinks she was killed in an accident back home. You're protecting him. I'm lying to him. Every day, I look at this boy who has his sister's eyes and her passion for justice, and I lie about how she died, because the truth would destroy his faith in the system that's supposed to protect people like him. Jade's voice was thick with self-recrimination. What kind of person does that make me? The kind who loves someone enough to carry their pain so they don't have to, Chen said without hesitation. The kind who sacrifices their own need to grieve openly so a 17-year-old boy can still believe the world is fair. Jade looked up at him, tears still tracking down her cheeks in the red emergency lighting, and saw something in his eyes she hadn't expected, understanding without judgment, recognition without pity. We're both carrying ghosts, Chen said quietly. You're Amira, my mother, the people we were before we learned how cruel the world could be. Is that what this is? Jade asked. 2 broken people finding each other in a locked building? Maybe. Or maybe it's 2 people who've been invisible for so long they forgot what it felt like to be seen. The emergency announcement crackled to life again. Another update about the ongoing situation. Another reminder that they were trapped in this moment, in this space between their carefully constructed facades and the messy truth of who they actually were. But for the first time in years, neither of them wanted to hide. The security update came at 3:17 a.m. The suspects had been apprehended, but the building would remain locked until the bomb squad could clear several suspicious packages that had been left behind. At least another 2 hours. Chen had gone to his office to retrieve his emergency stash, not the expensive scotch that impressed clients, but a thermos of jasmine tea his assistant kept stocked, and a small collection of snacks that he usually ignored. When he returned to conference room C, he found Jade standing at the windows, looking out at the city that sparkled beyond their red-lit imprisonment. Tea, he offered, setting the thermos on the table. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm. Jade turned, and something in her expression had softened since their earlier revelations. The careful armor she'd worn for 3 years had been replaced by something more open, more vulnerable. Thank you. That's very kind. They sat across from each other again, but closer now, the distance between them having shrunk with each shared truth. Chen poured tea into 2 coffee mugs he'd found in the break room, the ritual oddly intimate in the strange circumstances. Your mother, Jade said, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. What was her name? Lin Mei. The name came easily, without the usual tightness that accompanied memories of her. She loved jasmine tea. Said it reminded her of the garden her grandmother kept when she was small. Before, he gestured vaguely, encompassing all the upheavals that had led a young woman to clean offices as in a foreign country. She sounds like she was a wonderful person. She was patient, kind, stubborn as hell when she believed in something. Chen smiled, the expression transforming his face in ways that made Jade catch her breath. She would have liked you, I think. She always said the smartest people were the ones who could find dignity in any situation. Even cleaning offices? Especially cleaning offices. She used to tell me that honest work was nothing to be ashamed of, that the shame belonged to people who looked down on others for doing what needed to be done. Chen's voice carried a note of old regret. I wish I'd remembered that lesson better. Jade studied his face in the emergency lighting, seeing past the sharp angles of success to something softer underneath. You remembered it tonight, when you came looking for me instead of staying in your office. That was self-preservation. I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd left you alone after. He gestured helplessly. After being such a complete ass. Language, Mr. Chen, Jade said with mock severity, then broke into a smile that lit up her entire face. Though I suppose the circumstances call for it, Chen laughed, actually laughed, and the sound was so unexpected, so genuine, that Jade felt something warm uncurl in her chest. When had she last made someone laugh? When had someone's laughter made her feel like she was glowing from the inside out? Tell me about Marcus, Chen said, settling back in his chair. Not the painful parts, just, who is he? What does he dream about? The request was so simple, so human, that Jade felt tears prick her eyes again. When had anyone asked her about Marcus's dreams? About the boy who was the brightest spot in her carefully dimmed world. He wants to be a doctor, she said, warmth flooding her voice. Pediatric surgery. Specifically, he says if someone had been able to save his sister, maybe things would have been different. She paused, realizing what she'd revealed. He doesn't know the truth about how she died, but he knows she was sick before the accident he thinks killed her. Chen nodded, understanding the careful construction of protective lies. He's lucky to have you. Some days I wonder. I work nights, sleep, during the day when he's at school. We have dinner together and talk about his classes, his friends, his plans for college, but I worry that I'm not enough, that he needs more than a grieving woman who's afraid to dream about the future. You're raising a boy who wants to save children's lives, Chen said quietly. I'd say you're doing something right. They talked about Marcus's fascination with anatomy, his habit of leaving medical textbooks scattered around their small apartment, his determination to get into pre-med despite the financial obstacles. Jade's voice grew animated as she described his latest school project, a presentation on surgical techniques that had impressed his teachers. He sounds remarkable, Chen said, like his guardian. Like his sister, Jade corrected. Everything good in him comes from her. I'm just trying not to mess it up. Maybe that's enough. Trying not to mess it up while loving someone completely. The words hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine. But something had shifted in the space between them, some invisible barrier dissolving under the weight of shared stories and mutual recognition. What about you? Jade asked. Is there anyone? Family? Friends? Someone who sees past the billionaire facade? Chen was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his mug. There was someone once. In business school. Rebecca. She was brilliant, ambitious, everything I thought I wanted in a partner. His voice carried old sadness, but somewhere along the way to building my empire, I forgot how to let people close. She said loving me was like trying to hug a marble statue, beautiful from a distance, cold to the touch. She wasn't wrong, was she? No, I spent so long protecting myself from being dismissed or hurt that I became dismissive and hurtful. He looked up at Jade, his eyes holding a vulnerability she was beginning to recognize. I haven't let anyone close in years, it seemed safer that way. Safer, maybe. But not much of a life. No, Chen agreed, not much of a life at all. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking tea and listening to the distant sounds of the city beyond their locked tower. The emergency lighting continued its hypnotic pulse, but somehow it no longer felt ominous. It felt like they were suspended in a space outside normal time, where the rules of their carefully constructed lives didn't apply. When this is over, Jade said eventually, when they unlock the building and we go back to our separate lives, what happens to this? To us talking like actual human beings instead of boss and employee? The question Chen had been avoiding crystallized in the air between them. Impossible to ignore. In a few hours the emergency would end. The lights would come back on. the elevators would resume their normal operation. And they would both have to decide whether to pretend this night had never happened or figure out what came next. I don't know, Chen said honestly. I'd like to think we could. I don't know what we could do. Have coffee, talk about books, figure out how to be friends instead of strangers? Friends, Jade repeated, testing the word. I haven't had a friend in a long time. Neither have I. We might be terrible at it. Probably, Jade agreed. And they both smiled. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Two people who had been alone for so long they'd forgotten what connection felt like, tentatively reaching towards something that might be friendship or might be something deeper, if they were brave enough to find out. Chen? Jade said his name without the formal Mr. for the first time, and he felt something in his chest respond to the intimacy of it. Yes? Thank you. For staying, for listening, for seeing me as more than just. She gestured at her cleaning supplies, still arranged on the table beside their impromptu tea service. Thank you for letting me see, Chen replied, for showing me who you really are, even after I gave you every reason not to. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that competed with the emergency lighting. Soon, the building would come back to life. The spell of this strange night would break, and they would both have to return to the world where Chen Wei was the billionaire and Jade Thompson was the cleaning lady. But for now, in this suspended moment, they were just two people who had found each other in the dark, sharing tea and stories and the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they didn't have to be alone anymore. Sometimes the most meaningful connections happen in the most unexpected places. Have you ever found friendship or understanding with someone you initially misjudged? Share your story below. You never know who might need to hear about the power of second chances. The emergency lights pulsed around them, counting down the hours until they would have to discover if what they'd built in the darkness could survive in the light. The all-clear announcement came at 5:42 a.m., just as the first real sunlight was streaming through the conference room windows, washing away the red emergency lighting and bringing the harsh clarity of morning to their tea-stained sanctuary. Attention! The security lockdown has been lifted. All elevators and stairwells are now operational. Normal building access will resume at 6 a.m. Chen and Jade looked at each other across the table, the spell of their suspended night beginning to crack under the weight of returning reality. The thermos sat empty between them, surrounded by the detritus of their shared vigil: crumpled napkins, Chen's discarded suit jacket, Jade's cleaning supplies that had sat forgotten for hours. I should, Jade began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Should what? Pretend this never happened? Return to her cart and resume the invisible dance they'd performed for 3 years? Yes, Chen said, though neither of them moved. We should probably. The elevator chimed in the distance, followed by voices, security personnel, maintenance crews, the advancing army of morning that would restore order to their disrupted world. Chen straightened in his chair, and Jade watched his face transform as he remembered who he was supposed to be in daylight hours. It was Rosa who found them first, bustling into the conference room with the kind of maternal concern that made Jade's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Jade, Misha, we were so worried when we couldn't reach you. Rosa's eyes took in the scene, the empty thermos, the two chairs drawn close together, the way her employee was sitting with the building's owner like they were equals sharing breakfast instead of boss and subordinate caught in an emergency. I'm fine, Rosa, Jade said, standing quickly and moving toward her cart, just waiting it out like everyone else. But Rosa's sharp eyes had already catalogued everything: Jade's slightly rumpled sweater, Chen's loosened tie, the easy way they'd been sitting together before the intrusion of the outside world. Rosa had worked in buildings like this for 20 years, had seen powerful men and vulnerable women in compromising positions before, and her protective instincts flared immediately. Mr. Chen, Rosa said, her voice carefully respectful but carrying an undertone of steel. I hope Jade wasn't any trouble during the lockdown. The implication hit Chen like a slap, that Rosa saw him as a potential predator, saw Jade as someone who needed protection from men like him. The assumption stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. He was a man with power and she was a woman who cleaned his offices. In the harsh light of morning, their night of connection could easily be reframed as something ugly and exploitative. "No trouble at all," Chen said, his voice cooling back into its familiar corporate register. Ms. Thompson was completely professional. Professional. The word hung in the air like a door slamming shut. Jade flinched as if she'd been struck, watching Chen rebuild his walls in real time, watching him transform back into the distant executive who had never learned her first name. "Good," Rosa said firmly. "Jade, finish up here and head home. You've had a long night." More voices in the hallway now. Chen's assistant had arrived, along with his head of security and what sounded like half the building's management team. The real world was reasserting itself with a vengeance, washing away the fragile intimacy they'd built in the emergency lighting like sand castles before an incoming tide. "Mr. Chen?" His assistant's voice carried the particular urgency of someone dealing with crisis management. "The board is requesting an immediate briefing about last night's incident. There are liability concerns, insurance issues, and the media is already asking questions about security protocols." Chen looked at Jade one last time, and she saw the exact moment when he made his choice. The moment when the vulnerability he'd shown her became a liability he couldn't afford, when the connection they'd forged became a complication that threatened his carefully constructed world. "I'll be right there," he said to his assistant, then turned back to Jade with eyes that had gone cold and professional. "Thank you for your patience during the emergency, Miss Thompson. I hope the rest of your shift goes smoothly." Miss Thompson. Back to the formal distance, back to the careful boundaries that kept their worlds separate. Jade felt something shrivel inside her chest as she watched him gather his suit jacket and prepare to walk away from everything they'd shared. "Of course, Mr. Chen," she replied, her voice steady despite the fact that she felt like she was drowning. "Just doing my job." He paused at the doorway, and for a heartbeat, Jade thought he might turn around, might acknowledge what had passed between them, might fight for the fragile thing they'd built in the darkness. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and walked away, leaving her alone with Rosa's suspicious eyes and the bitter taste of morning light. "What the hell were you thinking?" The words exploded from Richard Hoffman, Chen's head of corporate communications, before Chen had even fully entered his office. Richard was pacing behind the desk, his usually perfect hair disheveled with stress, his tablet clutched in white-knuckled hands. "Good morning to you too, Richard," Chen said dryly, moving to his coffee machine. He needed caffeine, needed the ritual of normal morning routines to wash away the taste of jasmine tea and intimate conversation. "Don't good morning me. Do you have any idea what this looks like?" The CEO of Chen Industries, locked in a building overnight with a female employee? The press is going to have a field day if they get wind of this. "Nothing happened," Chen said, his voice sharp with defensive irritation. "It doesn't matter what happened, it matters what it looks like, what people will assume happened." Richard thrust his tablet at Chen, showing him a preliminary news report about the robbery and lockdown. "You're mentioned by name as being in the building. If someone connects you to the cleaning staff, if they start asking questions about who else was trapped." Chen felt his stomach drop as he understood the implications. It wasn't just about him, it was about Jade too, about how the story would be told, how she would be portrayed if their night together became public knowledge. The cleaning lady and the billionaire, locked together for hours, the assumptions people would make, the ugly implications that would follow her forever. "We need to control this narrative," Richard continued. "Limited statements about enhanced security protocols, focus on your leadership during the crisis. Absolutely no mention of other individuals involved unless specifically asked. You want me to pretend she wasn't there? I want you to protect both your reputation and hers by not giving the gossip mill any ammunition." Richard's voice softened slightly. "Look, I don't know what happened last night, and I don't want to know, But that woman doesn't deserve to have her life destroyed because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The words hit Chen harder than they should have. Because Richard was right, Jade didn't deserve to be collateral damage in the scandal that would inevitably follow if their story became public. She'd already lost one career to rumor and innuendo. She couldn't survive another. Chen's phone buzzed with a text from his mother sent from Shanghai, where she was probably just waking up, saw the news about trouble at your building. Are you safe, Wei Wei? The familiar nickname, combined with everything else swirling in his head, made Chen's chest tighten with complicated emotion. His mother would want to know about Jade, would ask questions about the woman who had shared his emergency with such grace. But how could he explain what had happened without sounding like he'd either exploited a vulnerable employee or lost his mind over a few hours of conversation? More messages were coming in. Board members wanting updates, investors concerned about security, reporters fishing for quotes. The machinery of his public life was grinding back into motion, demanding his attention, requiring him to be Chen Wei, the CEO, rather than just Chen, the man who had shared tea and stories with a remarkable woman in the early hours of morning. Schedule a press conference for this afternoon, Chen said finally. Standard crisis management, enhanced security, employee safety, minimal disruption to operations. And if they ask about other people in the building? Chen closed his eyes, seeing Jade's face in the emergency lighting, remembering the trust in her voice when she'd shared her deepest pain. We protect their privacy. No names, no details. Good, Richard said, relief evident in his voice. I'll draft the talking points. As Richard left, Chen stood at his window, looking down at the city where normal people were beginning their normal days. Somewhere out there Jade was probably getting on a bus or a subway, heading home to a small apartment where a teenager was getting ready for school, carrying the weight of their shared night like a secret she would never be able to tell. He'd done the right thing, hadn't he? Protected them both from the inevitable scandal, from the ugly assumptions and invasive questions that would have destroyed any chance of what? Friendship? Something more. The rational part of his mind knew that what they'd shared was impossible to sustain in the real world. He was Chen Wei, Billionaire CEO, and she was Jade Thompson, night shift cleaning lady. The distance between their worlds wasn't just about money, it was about power, expectations, the way society would view any relationship between them. But sitting alone in his executive office, surrounded by all the trappings of his success, Chen felt emptier than he had in years. As if he'd been offered something precious and rare, only to watch it slip through his fingers because he was too much of a coward to hold on. His reflection in the window looked back at him, and for a moment he saw not the successful businessman but the angry young man who had sworn never to become like the executives who had dismissed his mother. He'd kept that promise, in the worst possible way. The intercom buzzed with another meeting, another crisis, another demand for his attention. Chen straightened his tie, smoothed his expression back into its familiar mask of controlled competence, and prepared to spend another day pretending that last night had never happened. But the taste of jasmine tea lingered on his tongue, and the memory of genuine laughter, his own laughter, echoed in the pristine silence of his empty office. 3 days passed like a slow-motion car crash. Chen threw himself into damage control with the desperate efficiency of a man running from his own thoughts. Press conferences, board meetings, security briefings, anything to keep his mind occupied, anything to avoid the growing hollow in his chest that seemed to expand every time he passed conference room C or caught a glimpse of cleaning carts in his peripheral vision. He'd asked Rosa casually about staff schedules. Jade had taken sick leave. Rosa informed him with narrowed eyes that suggested she knew exactly why he was asking. Personal matters to attend to, she'd said, her tone making it clear that Chen's interest was neither welcome nor appropriate. Now it was Friday evening, and Chen stood in his office as the sun set over a city that suddenly felt enormous and empty. His reflection in the window looked hollow, successful but somehow diminished. like a photograph that had been overexposed until all the interesting shadows were gone. His phone buzzed. Another text from his mother. Wai Wei. You haven't responded to my calls. I'm worried. Even when you're busy, you usually find time to tell your old mother you're alive. The guilt twisted in his stomach. He'd been avoiding her calls because he knew she'd hear something different in his voice, would ask questions he didn't know how to answer. Lin Mei had always been able to see through his carefully constructed facades, had always known when her son was carrying pain he didn't want to share. This time, instead of ignoring the message, he called. Wai Wei. His mother's voice was warm with relief and sharp with maternal intuition. You sound tired. Are you eating properly? Sleeping? I'm fine, Mama. The endearment slipped out naturally, as it always did when he was feeling vulnerable. Just busy with work. The sound carried decades of experience reading her son's moods. I saw the news about the trouble at your building. Were you frightened? Chen closed his eyes, seeing red emergency lights and jasmine tea, hearing Jade's voice as she shared her deepest pain. Not frightened. Exactly. It was complicated. Complicated how? Were you alone? The question hung in the air, weighted with his mother's uncanny ability to find the heart of any matter. Chen found himself telling her about Jade, not everything, not the full depth of what had passed between them, but enough. About a woman who spoke perfect Mandarin, who had once been a professor, who was raising her nephew with quiet dignity despite circumstances that should have broken her. She sounds like a remarkable person, Lin Mei said when he finished. Did you help her during this emergency? I tried to. We talked, shared some tea. She told me about her life, her losses. Chen's voice grew quieter. She reminded me of you, in some ways, the strength, the grace under pressure. And now, the simple question cut straight through all his rationalizations and corporate speak. Now I'm protecting us both by pretending it never happened. The silence stretched across the Pacific, filled with everything his mother wasn't saying. Finally, Wei Wei, do you remember what I told you when you left for America? You told me many things, Mama. I told you that success without kindness is just expensive loneliness, that no amount of money could buy back a connection you were too proud to fight for. Her voice carried the gentle steel he remembered from childhood. Have you forgotten that lesson? It's not that simple. The complications, the assumptions people would make. About what? That a successful man recognized the worth of a good woman? That two people found comfort in each other during a difficult time? Lin Mei's voice sharpened. Or are you worried about what people will think about your mother's son caring for someone who works with her hands? The accusation hit like a physical blow. Chen saw himself clearly in that moment, not the self-made billionaire he'd become, but the ashamed little boy who had grown up embarrassed by his mother's calloused hands and tired eyes, who had spent his entire adult life running from anything that reminded him of where he'd come from. I don't know how to do this, Mama, he said, the words scraped raw from somewhere deep inside. I don't know how to be the kind of person who deserves someone like her. You learn, Lin Mei said simply. You choose to be better, and then you keep choosing, every day, until it becomes who you are instead of who you're pretending to be. After he hung up, Chen sat in the growing darkness of his office, his mother's words echoing in the silence. Outside, the city hummed with the lives of millions of people who were probably going home to families, friends, connections that mattered more than quarterly profits or stock prices. He thought about Jade, somewhere in that vast city, probably helping Marcus with homework or listening to him talk about his dreams of becoming a doctor. He thought about the way her face had lit up when she'd spoken about her nephew, the fierce love that had transformed her grief into protective strength. And he thought about himself alone in a tower of his own making, surrounded by success that felt increasingly meaningless, protected by walls that kept out pain but also kept out joy. His laptop was still open on his desk, cursor blinking in a blank email. Chen stared at it for a long moment, then began to type. Jade was grading Marcus's practice SAT essays at the kitchen table when her phone rang. She'd been avoiding most calls since taking sick leave, too many questions she didn't want to answer, too many concerned voices asking if she was all right when she couldn't explain why she wasn't. But this number was unfamiliar. Jade? It's Chen. Chen Wei. Her heart stopped, restarted, began racing in a way that felt dangerous. She'd spent 3 days trying to convince herself that their night together had been an aberration, a moment of connection that couldn't survive in the real world. Hearing his voice, not the cold corporate tone he'd used Friday morning, but something softer, more uncertain, made all her careful rationalizations crumble. "I know I have no right to call," he continued when she didn't respond. "After the way I handled things, the way I retreated into my corporate shell, but I've been thinking about what you said, about how we spend so much time protecting ourselves, that we forget to live." Jade looked around her small apartment at Marcus's textbooks, scattered across the table, at the stack of bills she'd been putting off opening, at the life she'd built from the ashes of her previous one. It was a good life, a safe life, but it was also a small life, carefully circumscribed by fear of being hurt again. "Chen," she began, then stopped, unsure what she wanted to say. "I sent you an email," he said. "Not to your work address. I had my assistant track down your personal email. I hope that's not presumptuous." It was presumptuous, but somehow it didn't feel invasive. It felt like reaching across the chasm that had opened between them, like refusing to let fear have the final word. After they hung up, Jade sat staring at her laptop for 10 minutes before opening her email. The message was brief. "Jade, I've been a coward. 3 days ago, you trusted me with your story, your pain, your hope for Marcus's future. You showed me who you really are, and I responded by hiding behind corporate protocols and social expectations. My mother raised me to be better than that. You make me want to be better than that. I don't know what's possible between us, or how to navigate the complications, but I know that I've spent 3 days feeling like I lost something precious, something I was too afraid to hold on to. Would you be willing to have coffee with me? Not as Mr. Chen and Ms. Thompson, but as Chen and Jade, two people who found something real in an emergency-lit conference room and were too scared to see where it might lead. I understand if you say no. I understand if the risks are too great, if I've already proven myself to be exactly the kind of man you can't trust. But if there's any chance that what we shared was real, that it could be the beginning of something instead of just a beautiful moment we'll both carry secretly forever, then I'm willing to fight for it. I'm willing to learn how to be the kind of person who deserves your friendship, your trust, maybe eventually more than that. The choice is yours. It has to be yours. Chen. P.S. I've been drinking jasmine tea every morning since Friday. It tastes like possibility. Jade read the email 3 times, her heart hammering against her ribs. Marcus came out of his room, took one look at her face, and sat down across from her with the grave concern of someone who'd learned too young to read the signs of adult distress. "Aunt Jay, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Jade said softly, then looked at this boy who was so much like his sister, who carried Amira's dreams of justice and healing into a world that had broken them both. "Marcus, if you had a chance at something good, something that might make you happy but also might hurt you, would you take it?" Marcus considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. "Depends. Would I regret not trying more than I'd regret trying and failing?" The wisdom of 17, cutting straight through her carefully constructed fears. Jade looked at her nephew, brilliant, brave, still believing the world could be fair despite everything life had taught him otherwise, and saw what she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. She'd been so busy protecting herself from being hurt again, that she'd forgotten how to hope for something better. "What would your sister tell me to do?" she asked. Marcus smiled, and for a moment, Amira's fierce optimism lived again in his expression. "She'd tell you that playing it safe is just another way of giving up. That the people who hurt you don't get to decide whether you ever trust again." Jade closed the laptop, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter window, sharp, clear, irreversible. She was terrified. And for the first time in 3 years, she was also hopeful. Outside, the city hummed with Friday night energy, people taking chances, making connections, choosing courage over caution. Somewhere in that vast network of lights and lives, Chen Wei was probably staring at his phone, waiting for her answer. Jade reached for her laptop and began to type. Yes. They met at a small cafe in Chinatown, deliberately chosen for its distance from Chen's corporate world and its abundance of jasmine tea. Jade arrived first, her hands wrapped around a warm cup, wearing a simple blue dress that transformed her from the invisible cleaning lady into the accomplished woman she'd always been beneath the uniform. When Chen walked through the door, scanning the room with nervous energy, she felt her breath catch. He looked different too, younger somehow, without the armor of his expensive suits. Just jeans and a sweater, like any other man meeting someone who mattered to him. Their eyes met across the crowded cafe, and for a moment, Jade was transported back to that emergency-lit conference room where they'd first seen each other clearly. The same recognition flickered between them, but stronger now, tempered by choice rather than circumstance. "Hi," Chen said, as he slid into the seat across from her, and the simple word carried everything they hadn't been able to say over email. "Hi yourself." Jade's smile was tentative but real. "You look nervous." "Terrified," he admitted, flagging down the waitress for his own cup of jasmine tea. "I've negotiated billion-dollar mergers that felt easier than this." "This is scarier," Jade agreed. "Business deals don't require you to risk your heart." They sat in comfortable uncertainty for a moment, both aware they were crossing into uncharted territory. The cafe buzzed around them with the easy intimacy of couples and friends, people who had figured out how to connect without corporate hierarchies and social expectations standing in their way. "I need to tell you something," Chen said, his fingers drumming against the table in the nervous habit Jade was learning to recognize. "After you said yes to meeting, I did something that might change everything." Jade's stomach tightened. "What kind of something?" "I offered you a job." The words hung between them like a live wire. Jade stared at him, processing the implications, feeling the careful balance of their new dynamic shift beneath her feet. "You what?" Chen held up his hands, recognizing the dangerous territory he'd entered. "Not like that. Not some corporate charity case or guilt offering. A real job, using your actual qualifications." He leaned forward, his voice gaining urgency. "Chen Industries is expanding our international development division. We need someone with your expertise in Sino-African economic relationships, someone who understands both the academic theory and the human cost of failed policies." Jade felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. "You're offering me an executive position. I'm offering you the chance to do the work you were meant to do. To use your research, your languages, your understanding of systems that could actually help people instead of just generating profit." Chen's eyes held steady on hers. The salary would be substantial, enough for Marcus's medical school, enough for you to build the life you deserve. "And enough to make us equals," Jade said quietly, understanding the deeper gift he was offering. "You were always my equal. This just makes it visible to everyone else." Jade looked down at her tea, watching the steam curl upward like her carefully constructed life dissolving into new possibilities. "There are people who will say you're only offering this because of whatever this is between us. Let them say it. Anyone who thinks you're not qualified hasn't done their homework." Chen reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "But I won't lie to you, part of me hopes that if you're not dependent on night shift cleaning work, if you have the financial security you deserve, then maybe we could see where this goes without all the complications." The touch of his hand sent warmth racing up Jade's arm. "And if I say no, if I decide the job offer feels too much like charity or manipulation?" Chen's fingers tightened briefly before he pulled back. "Then we figure out how to make this work anyway. Because whatever happens with the job, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." Jade studied his face, looking for the signs of corporate maneuvering she'd learned to recognize in her academic days. But all she saw was vulnerability, hope, and the kind of desperate sincerity that couldn't be faked. "Tell me about the position," she said finally. "Not the salary or the benefits. What would I actually be doing?" Chen's face lit up as he described a role that sounded like it had been designed specifically for her background: developing ethical trade partnerships, creating educational programs for emerging markets, building bridges between American corporations and African communities that had been exploited by previous generations of international development. "It's the work you wanted to do with Amira," he said softly. "Using economic development as a tool for justice instead of just profit." The mention of her lost daughter's student made Jade's eyes fill with tears. "You remember her name?" "I remember everything you told me that night, including how much it would mean to you to continue her work." Jade was quiet for a long moment, feeling the weight of possibilities settling around her like a new skin. Then she smiled, the full, radiant expression that transformed her entire face. "I accept," she said, "both the job and whatever this is we're trying to build." Chen's relief was so profound it was almost comical. "Really? You're sure?" "I'm terrified and excited and probably making a huge mistake," Jade said, laughing at his expression. "But yes, I'm sure. Under one condition. Anything. I want to bring Marcus to the office sometime, let him see what it looks like when someone builds something meaningful, when work becomes mission instead of just survival." "Of course. And Jade?" Chen's voice grew serious. "I know this won't be easy. People will talk, will make assumptions. My world can be brutal, especially to people it doesn't immediately understand." "Your world," Jade repeated thoughtfully, "not our world." The correction made Chen pause, then smile in a way that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Our world, I like the sound of that." They talked for 3 hours, mapping out the logistics of her transition, the timeline for leaving her cleaning position, the delicate dance of starting over in a space where their personal and professional lives would inevitably intersect. But underneath the practical details was something deeper: the growing recognition that what had started as an accidental connection in an emergency-lit conference room was becoming something real, something worth fighting for. When they finally left the cafe, the sun was setting over Chinatown, painting the narrow streets in shades of gold and amber. They walked slowly, neither quite ready to end this moment of possibility. "There's something else," Chen said as they reached the corner where they would part ways, him to his penthouse, her to the subway that would carry her home to Marcus. "I called my mother after I sent you that email." "What did she say?" Chen smiled, and Jade could see the boy he'd once been, eager to make his mother proud. "She said she's looking forward to meeting the woman who reminded me how to be human." "You want me to meet your mother?" The question carried weight. The recognition that this was about more than attraction or convenience, more than healing old wounds or satisfying curiosity. "I want her to meet the woman I'm falling in love with," Chen said simply. The words hung between them in the golden evening light, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Jade felt her heart stutter, then begin beating in a new rhythm, not the quick flutter of fear she'd carried for 3 years, but the steady drum of hope. "Chen," she said, stepping closer until she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "I think I'm falling in love with you too." The kiss was gentle, tentative, a question asked and answered in the space between one heartbeat and the next. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "So what happens now?" Jade asked. "Now we figure it out as we go," Chen replied. "Together." As Jade descended into the subway station, her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "How did it go? Do I need to give this guy the nephew speech about treating you right?" She typed back. "Maybe, but I think you're going to like him. He asked about your medical school plans." "Smart man. Anyone who cares about my dreams gets the benefit of the doubt. Anyone who makes you happy gets my vote." Jade smiled as the train pulled into the station, carrying her home to a life that was about to change in ways she was only beginning to imagine. In her purse was Chen's business card, not the corporate card he handed out in meetings, but a simple piece of paper with his personal number written in his own handwriting, like a promise that this was real. 6 months later, Dr. Jade Thompson would walk into the gleaming offices of Chen Industries International Development, her PhD finally meaning something again, her expertise valued and respected. Marcus would visit on weekends, wide-eyed at the height of the building, proud of his aunt who had rebuilt her life from the ashes of the old one. But that evening, riding the subway home with jasmine tea still warming her tongue and the memory of Chen's smile lighting up her heart, Jade simply felt grateful. Grateful for second chances, for the courage to say yes, for the unexpected ways love could find you when you'd given up looking for it. In his penthouse across the city, Chen Wei stood at his window, looking out over the lights of millions of lives intersecting in ways both random and miraculous. His reflection looked back at him, but for the first time in years, he recognized the man he saw, not just successful, but whole. We all have moments that change everything. Sometimes they come in emergencies, sometimes in quiet conversations over tea. Have you ever experienced a connection that transformed how you see yourself and the world? Share your story below. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simple courage to see each other clearly. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, new reasons why what they built might not survive in the harsh light of corporate politics and social expectations. But tonight, two people who had been lonely for too long were lonely no more. And that felt like victory enough to last a lifetime.
If this story of unexpected love touched your heart, the next one will absolutely amaze you. It's even more emotional and life-changing than you can imagine. A connection so powerful, it will restore your faith in destiny. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch it unfold. Thank you for staying with Chen and Jade's beautiful journey to the very end.